fueled by poorly designed social protection systems, and the emphasis on targeting not as a way to ensure universality, but as a way to exclude some people from the high quality services. So we insist social protection systems that are universal, growth friendly, fiscally sustainable, and truly inclusive could be one immediate response to try to provide people a sense of economic security that could trigger eventually political dynamics that can be, better than what we have today. Because now what we have is very targeted, specific responses from, in many cases, leaders that want to strengthen their centralized capacity to control power, rather than something that is more, socially discussed, processed, and so on. So I just want to leave it there. If you ask me one thing that UNDP is proposing to try to address this legitimacy crisis from the outcome and the process side, we would say that a discussion on how to bring back universality of a minimum package, social protection, health education, unemployment insurance, and the like, finance through the same source and so on, and look at ways to, because then the discussion of, for example, tax reforms don't become the objective. The tax reform is not an objective, it's an instrument. So if we really want to think about what it means to renew a social contract, let's discuss what is the minimum level of security that we should collectively provide to everybody and how we finance that. And then we build from there. So I would just leave it there to end with a positive proposal, concrete proposal from UNDP.
Thank you very much, Luis Felipe. Thanks for your contribution to the panel.
I apologize that I have to go now.
Bueno, un gusto, es un placer, éxito.
President Fernández.
Yes, I would like to kind of present a historical perspective on where we stand at this moment. Since 2010, some countries in the region have been celebrating the bicentennial of our independence. I should have begun in 2004 because really the first country in the region to gain independence was Haiti. But it is forgotten always. And so we begin celebrating from 2010 until 2025, all the independence movements in Latin America. Since our inceptions as nation states, we aspired democracy. But democracy never came through. We had dictators, we had military ruling class. It was only in the last 40 plus years that we have been able to transition from authoritarian regimes into democratic systems. Have we progressed in the last 4 decades in Latin America? Absolutely. Anywhere you go in Latin America today is radically different of what it was 40 years before. In terms of infrastructure development, you can see it, I'm sorry, you can see it anywhere. When you go to Chile, from the airport to the city, it's called Shanhattan. When you say, what is Shanhattan? It's a combination of Shanghai and Manhattan. The notion of modernization, right? Can you imagine we have a subway system in the Dominican Republic? That there's a subway system in Panama, that is also many other subway systems in other places. There is an indication there has been progress. Poverty has been reduced, middle class has been expanded, people travel continuously. When I was coming to LA, I found someone from the Dominican Republic on the plane. I said, where are you going? I'm going to Wisconsin, he said. I can't imagine a Dominican going to Wisconsin. I can imagine going to New York, Washington Heights, but not to Wisconsin.
Cheese.
Well, there you go. He was going to a milk festival because we have cattle raising in the Dominican Republic. But now Dominicans go to Wisconsin to participate in a global festival about how to you milk cows, right? So it's a way of indicating that we have becoming more integrated worldwide. But the reason why we have progressed is because we have solved politically a main problem that we have discussed on the table today. How do you access power? And before, even in the 60s, in our case, the Dominican experience, a dictatorship, a long-standing dictatorship was brought down, Trujillo's regime. Juan Bosch came from exile, a friend of Jose Figueres, the Caribbean Legion. He was elected at a landslide, the first democratically elected president after a long-term dictatorship. 7 months after, he was overthrown by a military coup. There was a major popular insurrection in 1965 in the Dominican Republic. The slogan was to return to democratic constitution, elected government. And then there was a US military occupation inspired by the Cold War, preventing a second Cuba in the Caribbean. Dominican Republic had nothing to do with a socialist Cuban oriented revolution. It was democratic constitutionally, but the Cold War environment created this decision by the Johnson administration. So when my generation started participating in politics, the idea was, we aspire democracy, but it's impossible. The path to democracy has been obstructed. So the notion of revolution came through. And I would say the inspiration was the Cuban Revolution. And everywhere in Latin America in the 60s, the youth wanted to participate in a revolutionary process. It was only at the end of the 70s, beginning in the Dominican Republic, where we had elections that were contested, and a change of regime, an alternation of democratic power, and then all the 80s and afterwards, we have had elections as the only legal and legitimate way to access power. And because of that, we have democratic political stability. And with democratic political stability, you get economic growth, sustainable progress, prosperity, and well-being. The other side of the picture is Haiti. Since Haiti doesn't have stable democratic political, it's always in the midst of Haiti, progress is an answer to what it's not only a failed state, it's a collapsed state nowadays. But the main reason, it doesn't have democratic political stability. What we have in Latin America that enables progress, that enables sustainable development and well-being is because we have had, for the first time in our history, during 40 years, democratic political stability. And we have to work in order to strengthen that in all the ways we can.
We have had three
Yes.
positive comments in a row, so it seems it's contagious, yeah, so.
I mean, you want to serve.
So whoever's up next, you know,
Mine's not
we're on a
positive.
roll here. Please keep it going.
The coffee is kicking in.
President Chinchilla,
I
please.
think that we should bring a very important pillar for democracies to stay, to be stable, to have the possibility to project to the future, and that is the rule of law. And when I listen to what we have already said about the progress we have been able to achieve in our region, there is no doubt. Any kind of indicator that you can take, you will see that we have achieved amazing progress. In fact, in terms of democracy, we are still the most successful region. 40 years of democracy, and it covers almost all the countries, with the exception of Cuba. All of them were democracies at a certain point. Then during the last year, we lost Venezuela and we lost Nicaragua. But we didn't do enough in terms of the rule of law. And what we are seeing is that since other kind of menaces, surge as a result, for example, of the growing presence of organized crime in many of the countries, which is one of the main factors that explain the corruption basically in Central America, Colombia, Mexico. When you see those bureaucratic elites making businesses with some business elites, with any kind of disregard of ethical principles, when you see the abuses of power, et cetera, and there is no response coming from the justice system. So it is impossible to imagine that democracy can prevail if you don't have a robust system of rule of law. And so in certain way, the new rulers, the new leaders, this kind of unscrupulous populists that we have now again in our region aspiring to take power, they know it very well. They know that it is very easy to get access to power through precisely legitimate means, because all of them have won an election, but they know that once they access to power, once that they are in government, they can ignore the other considerations of a democratic system, a democratic governance, which is respecting the laws, respecting the Constitution, et cetera, et cetera. So it is true that, that we have many positive things in the region, but my message basically is that we shouldn't take democracy for granted. We already have two examples, Venezuela and Nicaragua. Nicaragua was a very weak democracy, but Venezuela was one of the only three democracies that we had during the 70s. Colombia, Venezuela, and Costa Rica, and look what happened. And what I see now in the rest of the Central American countries is la Nicaraguaciación de Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador. They are following almost the same path. And probably we will have even more examples. So the rule of law is something, and also we should put attention about what is happening with the military. Because they are there. They're playing a more discreet role, but they are becoming the arbiters of political crisis. That was very clear, for example, in the case of Bolivia. They are participating more and more in the economy. They are controlling many state-owned enterprises. And I can give you the cases of Mexico, the case of course, Venezuela and Nicaragua. So I'm also, with this very weak rule of law and a growing role of the military again, and with these leaders, populist kind of leaders, I think that we are getting a mix of explosive elements that attempt against democratic governance.
Rebecca?
So I'm going to follow on what President Chinchilla was saying, and I really appreciated the way Luis Felipe ended his conversation about looking at the budgets of governments to see how much is being spent on agencies that actually control executive power. So, the traditional agencies of horizontal accountability versus how much of the budget goes to strengthening the centralization of power. And he used the example of the funding of the military. What's the balance? And I thought that was a really powerful way and useful way of looking at it, because, I think what President Chinchilla's point is excellent. You have democratically elected leaders who then deliberately dismantle these agencies of horizontal accountability. And if you're looking at the courts through even though the Constitution calls for judicial autonomy, you see practices like court packing, the violations of judicial tenure production. We see it with the attorney generals, sort of the lack of independence of attorney generals. So the judiciary is also, in rule of law, also so important to tackling corruption, which is a major issue in the region. But I also wanted to highlight the point about the military, and I say this from someone who served in DOD. The growing militarization of the region is extremely concerning. We see it in the militarization of law enforcement, the militarization of migration policies is another area. The example, I think there was the scenes in El Salvador's Congress when the military went in to kind of intimidate members of Congress to support Bukele's legislation I mean, I agree. I think that the military, we don't hear enough about this trend. And I think it's something very important for us to keep an eye on.
Go ahead, Dan.
Look, again, this is very interesting, but I'm gonna pick up on a point that I found really, really interesting mentioned by President Fernández, which is this. I mean, I'll put it like this. I mean, it's almost like a soundbite. I guess the previous generation in Latin America showed that democracy is possible. The task for the current generation is to show that democracy is good and fair. That's a different task, and it's a more complicated task. I mean, what we see in public opinion surveys in the region is that people in Latin America support democracy in the abstract, but they are deeply, deeply unhappy with democracy in practice, right? And the reason for this disaffection is connected to some of the things that have been mentioned here. I mean, number one, the question of the rule of law, which continues to be a huge pending assignment for the region. I mean, particularly, and there are many aspects to this, but there are two that are particularly salient. The question of corruption and impunity for corruption. That's an absolutely toxic issue for democracy, and not just in Latin America. I mean, we see it in from the standpoint of international idea, we see it at play virtually everywhere. I mean, the effect of corruption on democratic legitimacy is a really toxic one. So this angle of the lack of rule of law has to be addressed in a very urgent way. And the question of public security, which is another big one that is important for the rule of law and that has an impact on the quality of life for people. So that's one big agenda. And then the other is the question, again, of delivery. And to go back to that notion that people support democracy in the abstract, but not in practice. I mean, look, we can make here in this room the normative argument for democracy until we go blue in the face. For the immense majority of people, what matters is whether democracy is able to solve real problems for real people. That's what matters. And I guess the practical implication of that is the urgency of putting at the heart of public debates in Latin America, the question of the quality of democratic governance. And that means a few things. I mean, there might be others. That means tackling questions of institutional design that you know a lot of. I mean, you know a lot about, Jerry. I mean, how to design our political systems in ways that make them better able to solve issues in a more efficient and efficacious way. And I'll give you one concrete example that I used the other day, on a discussion where President Chinchilla participated in as well. This very visible thing that we have in Latin America, and very problematic, the coexistence of presidential systems with highly fragmented and increasingly fragmented party systems, which we know from decades ago in political science that is a problematic setup. And yet, we see very little in the way of reform efforts to rethink the constitutional architecture of our political systems. So this agenda matters. Number two, what Luis Felipe mentioned, the question of fiscal robustness as a prerequisite for political systems to be able to respond to social demands. How you collect your revenue and how you spend your public resources. I mean, there has to be a discussion about that at the heart of a robust democratic governance agenda. The question of the quality of public administration, which is a truly central one. This used to be seen, as a peripheral issue, as a technical issue. It's not. I mean, the quality of public administration is the tool of the trade for governments to respond to social demands. And finally, the question of trust, which, as we've seen during the pandemic, I mean, trust is arguably the single most powerful determinant in the effectiveness of governments to respond to crisis, whether they elicit the trust of the citizens. And you cannot talk about trust, again, without talking about the question of corruption. If you're not serious about dealing with corruption, trust would never be rebuilt. So, I mean, this is the kind of agenda that I think should be at the heart of our public debates in Latin America, because it's instrumental to solve everything else. And I'll leave it at that.
All right. Just to second Kevin's point, sort of this is from my own research, I'm putting more and more emphasis, and I think sort of it's more and more important, state capacity, sort of the quality of the public administration reforms that are needed. So the policy process can come up with some great laws and policy initiatives, but if it's not implemented in an efficacious way without corruption, sort of, I think you're not going to deliver. So I think that's sort of a key sort of part of the problem. I don't think it's being discussed enough. You want to add to that?
No, I just wanted, so we had hosted a mayor's summit on Tuesday as one of the events on the side, on the margins of the summit, the broader summit. And one of the things that came out that was really interesting, I thought, is that, and it gets to this point of public administration and trust in government, is in the US at least, a recent survey shows that 72% of US citizens have faith in their local leaders versus 25% in the federal government. And it was really, this is a positive note. It was really heartening to hear from these mayors that are actually, they are delivering, that they, in a way, I came away that at the city level, we see these bulwarks against authoritarianism, because by solving problems like addressing climate change, addressing migration, the mayor of Bogota was there and she was talking about the 500,000 new Bogotanos that are now living in Bogota. At the local level, I do see hope.
That is true.
Yeah.
That is true. I would say that there are good things happening in terms of state and public administration reform. We can see many specific experiences at the local level. I would say that we have many examples there. And also there are very positive developments in terms of using digital technologies to better deliver public services in terms of more transparency, more efficiency, less cost to the people. I would say that there are some efforts there that should be encouraged by regional institutions, etc. My concern is about reforming the political system. Nothing is being discussed seriously. It seems to be that it is prohibited in the region to speak about something different than the presidential system. And what is happening, that we are trying with two kinds of responses. One is more hyper-presidentialism, because for many people, that is the best way to resolve the limitations that we have in terms of democratic governance. So let's give the power to one strong man so he will be able to resolve everything. And let's put all the powers in his hands. And we can see what is happening with this kind of responses. But that is one of the responses that is being tried in some countries. And the other kind of response is fragmentation. Electoral reforms and political reforms, they are positively aimed at encouraging more participation, but the final results is a diminished governance because we are fragmenting the political representation. Nothing is between. There is nothing now reasonable being thought about what to do in terms of political reform. And for me, that is probably the most critical issue we should resolve.
Well, I think we all agree on what we're saying. Perhaps it's a different angle that we take. I would say I was trying to make the point that we do have an electoral democracy and that we have solved a historical problem, that the only path to access power is through elections. And nowadays, we don't have right-wing military coups or left-wing guerrillas. So it's through elections that we access power. And because of that, there has been political stability in the last 40 years. And today we're better off than we were 40 years ago. This is my point. Now, I understand that there is a sense of ambiguity and complexity in what is taking place in the region and worldwide. Perhaps we can borrow from Dickens' metaphor. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. And I think this is for Latin America and for the rest of the world. Now, what would be our challenges nowadays? I would say, yes, we need to strengthen the rule of law, absolutely. We need to have an independent judiciary, yes. But if you look at the polls today, what are the people really thinking about? The three major issues that are impacting citizens in Latin America. Number one, the cost of living. Now, this is today. Secondly, unemployment. Third, crime and violence. These are the three main issues. Of course, there's some other issues. There's a crisis of confidence that we've talked about, and we know that is true. Political parties, the traditional political parties, are just disappearing, and we have new political parties that are coming to the fore. In the last two elections, Costa Rica, something that you know much better than me, the ruling party came in third, was unable to participate in the runoff. In Colombia, the ruling party ended third, was not able to go to the second round. So there is a problem with political parties, with parliaments. There's a problem with democratic institutions. They're not up to people's expectations. They're not functioning. So there is a need to have political reform, but also is, having political reform in theory is being able to really deliver to people's needs and expectations. This is a problem that we see. You take the police, for example, and this is part of Bukele's success in El Salvador, because he has understood that through traditional institutional channels, many problems are not solved. You have these gangs, how do you call it? Las maras, the maras. Well, cruel, terrible. They hijack people. What happens? Bukele comes in. He has a hardline policy against them. He jails them, and he denies them lunch. I'm not going to give you lunch today because you have behaved very bad. People applaud that. That's the way you should go. The argument that these violent gang members should be respected and their human rights, people respond, yes, but how about the victims? These guys are not respecting the victims' human rights, so why should we respect them? So this rhetoric, this new way of dealing with problems, which is out of traditional institutional channels, is having a reception. It's being considered as an alternative to what we have done traditionally, right? You look at the problem of drug trafficking. Most likely military and police are participating in drug trafficking and arms trafficking. Now, if you engage the police in being rewarded with part of what has been taken away from the drug dealers, you create some sort of a reward, some stimulus to them, they might be able to have a different way of behaving towards the problem. But if they earn $500 a month, this is their salary for a police captain, $500 a month, and the drug dealers are giving him $2 million, what do you expect? I mean, he sees it as a game changer for him, as it changes his way of life. So we have to look at it from, I would say, innovative ways. No, we have to look at what has been put in place for the last 40 years has not worked out in terms of institutions. So we have to think out of the box, being innovative, bring new, fresh ideas in order to solve these problems. This is what I think about the institutions. Now, as you see, the cost of living, Unemployment, this is the problem today. But it's also about having access to water supply, is having access to electricity, having access to an quality education. These are the main problems. Access to a healthcare system that can really deliver. So we have an agenda of problems that have been from the past that has not been able to be solved yet. But at the same time, we're being challenged with robotics and artificial intelligence and algorithms and all this new stuff, which is the 21st century. So we're trapped, not solving problems of the past and being challenged by problems of the future. I think that we need to change our economic and social model of development. It has been successful for 40 years. It doesn't guarantee it's going to be successful in the future. We have had a labor-intensive economic development system, extractive industries in South America. But at the same time, there's a widening gap between the developed world and the developing world in terms of technologies, as you said before. The digital, we don't have digital markets in Latin America. Not enough, I would say. We don't have a Latin American Amazon, not even local. Not even local do we have e-commerce developed in our countries. So we need to move forward into a more capital-intensive, technologically driven economic model. Combining with the rest, we have to solve the problems of quality of education, access to water supply, but at the same time, we need to move forward in terms of digital technologies for education, for agricultural production, for healthcare. Because if we do not do that, we are only passive consumers of high tech. We need to create new products and services, more value added with the use of technology. I think this is the road for the future in Latin America in really to move forward. So it is, yes, political reform, institutional reforms, but also a new sustainable economic and social model that looks into the future.
Last comment before I open for
Sure.
questions, Kevin.
Look, 2 points. I mean, one about how several of these issues are interconnected. And I'll give you one concrete example. The question of the fragmentation of party systems and the apparent lack of willingness to engage in a serious effort to pursue political reform. This creates a very perverse incentive for corruption. I mean, if you're the president of Brazil and you have to deal with a Congress where 30 plus party systems are represented, constructing a workable majority to push forward a reform agenda is an impossible task. There are many ways to build such a majority. One of them is by purchasing it. And that's exactly what has happened in Brazil, repeatedly. So you see how a problem of institutional design fits into corruption. So that's one point. The second point is about what President Fernández has just said. This apparent disconnect between the need to pursue political reform and the more topical issues that are affecting people's lives. And this disconnect is very true. I mean, political reform is not a sexy issue. I mean, it's not a vote winner anywhere. And this is a case yet where the urgent trumps the important. If we don't engage in serious political reform, we will not be able to solve all the other issues. At the very minimum, we have to be able to walk and tweet at the same time, right? I mean, we have to be able to address some of the more urgent issues, but we need to engage in the long-term political reform that we so sorely need. And the trick here, I would think, and is a major feat of political leadership that is needed, is how to connect in the discourse, how to connect political reform to people's well-being. That's the trick. And it's not an easy one to pull off, but it's an essential one in the current situation in Latin America.
Okay, you have all been incredibly patient. We're gonna now move to the Q&A from the floor. Also, the people watching us online through the chat. We have two helpers here, Natalia and Senisa will take the mic to you. Can you please identify yourself? Why don't we start with Vicky and then Max? Please identify yourself and ask your question.
Hello to everyone here, and thank you so much for such an fascinating conversation. So I'm Victoria Chonchen from University of Southern California. I have many questions, but I'm going to zero it in one in particular, just because it's circling back to the comments that particularly President Fernández and Mr. Casasamora made about digital media technology. I think you hinted at it, but my question goes to what role do you think technology has to enhance or weaken democracy in the region? Because we have colliding effects. On the one hand, we have the usage of technology, right? In which citizens use it to participate. And I think that goes to the point of President Chinchilla with projects, civil society. So that's great because it enhances democratic behavior. On the other hand, you also have the uses of technology, and you mentioned Bukele many times, who is extremely savvy in managing information and calling himself, I am the coolest dictator in the world, right? And when he was candidate, it actually helped him to gain popularity. So attached to that, so as leaders, as organizations, and as we talk about reforms and communication, because technology is for dissemination, but it's also to access information. How do we make sure and ensure, right, that there's also not disinformation, and that you can also show that democracy is delivering? I know this is an unfair question, it's convoluted, it's a lot, but I'm curious how you as leaders of different organizations can see that, because again, I think President Fernández made the point. This is the 21st century. We have a new generation, right, that wants to see democracy work. But how do you also communicate that in such a way that speaks to everyone's interest and also speaks to everyone's way in accessing information? Because it's not the same as some decades ago. Thank you.
Please, panelists, whoever wants to respond.
Just want to put some elements, but I will be sure that my colleagues will add to this reflection. I was part of a global commission on digital technologies and democracy. And there was a very interesting conclusion about that. Yes, technologies have a very important role to play in the quality of public debate, and that was mentioned by Luis. That usually when those technologies are used in an environment which is characterized previously by polarized media, as it is the case in the United States, for example, that media existed before on the social media. So when you have those kind of conditions, polarized environments, high distrust levels to elites, illiteracy in general, not only digital illiteracy. I mean, deficits of education, okay? So what you will find is that digital technologies most probably will incentivize the worst of the society. So I mention this because it is very common to blame digital technologies for all the problems that we already have in our societies and in our political systems, and also to blame them for the faults of mediocre leadership that we're having in our societies. If you have a leader who doesn't mind how he is talking to his people, come on. I mean, politics is about educating the people. So you will never change anything with this kind of leaders. So in certain way, I say this because, of course, I think that there is a role for social media. In fact, at that time, we recommended actions at different levels. First, the technological platforms needed to adopt many kind of ethical codes. They needed to make some changes in the designing of the algorithms. They needed to better moderate the content of, in some cases, we discuss about the business model too. So there are many things happening in that side. I will also say that there is a challenge of regulation. If you ask me, my preferred model is Europe. I don't like the way the United States is working with that because, among other things, it is impossible to follow the example of the United States when you belong to a small economy. So in our countries, for example, we don't have any possibility to negotiate with the big platforms. So the only way will be collectively, and that is a problem because I don't remember Latin America as divided as it is today. We are unable to bring together our governments for anything in trying to coordinate any kind of policy. But the only way for those countries will be coming together to try to negotiate with the digital platforms or try to encourage the United Nations to adopt certain kind of instruments. And finally, we strongly recommended to invest in people, in education, in literacy, in encouraging the public debate, in civic education. So if you bring those elements together, probably you will find something different. Now, a final word. Yesterday, I had meetings with the Nicaraguans, with the Venezuelans, with the Cubans, those who are suffering the effects of those dictatorships. And for them, digital technologies is the way through which they have been able to organize themselves, to raise abuses. So let's be careful, because whenever we try to control social media or to put the power to control social media in some authorities, in some governments, we can end up with a worse result.
Anybody else want to add?
Yeah, I would like to add to what Laura has said. I think there's a bright side and a dark side in the use of technologies. And the bright side is just what Laura has said. You empower sectors of society to deliver a struggle against authoritarianism, against dictatorships, etc. Now, there's also a dark side to all this. We know that bots are used, and that can somehow, I would say, create a false perception of what reality is all about. Fake news, the idea of fake news, of misinformation, disinformation, which is more than traditional propaganda. We can all identify propaganda. But when you're using bots and algorithms and you create messages that become viral, and people think that this is public opinion trend that is dominating, and it's not true, you create a problem. And I think democracy is being challenged by these types of misuse of technology, to create a false public opinion, create followers in those opinion trends, and alienate people from following up on what good measures should be in order to strengthen democracy and move forward. So I would say, I look at technology, you're looking at it from a political perspective. How can social media be used? We all understand it's a revolution. For the first time, you have interactive communication worldwide simultaneously, But I also look at it from a socioeconomic standpoint. I think our countries, Latin America, needs to move forward in terms of manufacturing goods and services, more value added with the use of technology, right? And I think in order to do that, we need more, a more, I would say, tight link with the US system. I think connecting, in our case, I always see Florida because of our geographical proximity, connecting Latin American countries with Florida, the fourth state in the union with technological development, in anything that has to do with hardware and software, I would say hardware assembling. If we can have businesses in Latin America that can begin with light high tech, like assembling hardware computers, but also doing software development, developing apps for mobile phones. We can train our youth in doing this. In Costa Rica, you have Intel since many years ago. In the Dominican Republic, we created the Santo Domingo Cyber Park, which is supposed to be a high-tech corridor. We created the Technological Institute of the Americas. We have trained over 50,000 youngsters who are capable in different areas of technology. So it's connecting, and it's being part of a more broad process. It's not only Latin America. We have to link to the rest of the world. In our case, it's linking more to the US system, which leads worldwide in terms of high-tech development. So I see it from a political standpoint, but also from a socioeconomic development standpoint.
So we take a question from Max, Sophia. Max first.
Thank you very much. Professor Bill Chavez used the phrase horizontal accountability, and I'd like to sort of pursue that theme a little bit. In political science, we make a distinction between vertical accountability and accountability of
Can you
elected
talk louder into the
leaders.
mic?
Is it okay?
Is that the issue? I'd stand up.
Sure. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. So in political science, we often make a distinction between vertical accountability, the accountability of elected leaders to citizens through parties and mechanisms of representation, versus horizontal accountability, which you mentioned, the accountability of agencies of government, one to the other, separation of powers, check and balances, human rights ombudspersons, offices, and that sort of thing. And high quality democracies tend to score high on both dimensions. What's really striking, if you look at the data on Latin America, in particular over the last decade, is that there are no cases in the region where you see simultaneously the improvement on both dimensions. In two cases, we see the deterioration in both dimensions, and that's Nicaragua and Venezuela. But mostly what we see in the region is either improvements in vertical accountability or improvements in horizontal accountability, but not both. It seems as if we get leaders who have powerful parties and movements behind them, to which they're to some degree accountable, but who behave in ways that undermine horizontal accountability or checks and balances. Or we get leaders who respect the constitutional rules of the game and very quickly see the erosion of their popularity. They become very unpopular, and there's a sort of a sense that they're not delivering. Why is it, in your view, I have my own theories, but I'd love to hear any reflections you might have on why it is that simultaneous improvements in both dimensions of accountability seem to be so elusive in the region.
This is Max Cameron from Professor at the University of British Columbia.
So so vertical accountability is right. That's where the elections come in, fair and free elections.
Okay, good.
And I would agree with what President Fernández has said about the progress we've made when it comes to vertical accountability, with exceptions like the ones that you called out. But I think that the erosion of horizontal accountability began a long time ago. I mean, we saw it in the 90s in a country like Argentina under Carlos Menem. I mean, this is where there was like this deliberate erosion of these agencies of horizontal accountability. The courts are an obvious one, but the ones that you mentioned as well, where, the Congress is supposed to be a horizontal accountability, but we see that, under hyper-presidential systems, Congress also disappears as an agency of accountability. So, my greatest concern is about these agencies of accountability. And that's, I thought that's why I was so struck by this idea of looking at a budget and seeing how much of it is going to strengthen horizontal accountability, because my guess is it's steadily decreased over time in the region. Vice these, I think he framed it as kind of more autocratic agencies like the military. But I think when we're thinking about the rule of law, when we're thinking about liberal democracy, anything beyond electoral democracy, these agencies are critical. And I think that I really appreciate that question, because it's what we should be focusing on.
that's one heck of a question, right? I mean, I guess the obvious answer is a fairly banal one. Well, because these things are difficult, right? And that's why you don't find it easy to advance on both fronts. But I'll give you a slightly more sophisticated answer, I think. I think that sequencing in the process of building a democratic system matters a lot. And what I'm thinking about here is that when you take, and I'm going to paint here with a broad brush, right? When you take democracies in the Northern Atlantic, plus, the Australias and New Zealands that are, similar in many ways, those places had rule of law before they had democracy and before they had universal suffrage in particular, right? In Latin America, we're trying to build democratic systems the other way around. So we have the electoral side of democracy reasonably well consolidated, and we definitely have universal suffrage, but we don't have rule of law. And the problem is that the political pressures that dominate the electoral side of democracy and the social demands that are channeled that way very often work at cross purposes with the notion of strengthening horizontal accountability, with the notion that you need to create checks and balances that are worthy of that name. So how do you get out of that? I don't know, because we were dealt the hand we were dealt, right? When democracy came about in Latin America. But I'm just trying to say that the way in which we are trying to build democratic systems in Latin America presents particular challenges. And I never fail to remember when we have these discussions the quip uttered by former British Prime Minister Gordon Brown when they were talking about rule of law issues, and he said something to the effect of, well, when it comes to the rule of law, to building the rule of law, you have to know that the first 500 years are the hardest ones, right? Well, that's the way this works. I mean, this kind of thing doesn't happen overnight, and it will take generations for Latin America to build decent horizontal accountability institutions, I think.
I saw a hand at that table, and that table, we have pretty little time, so we'll take both questions together. Do you want to start there and then at that table?
Hello, I'm Kelvin Arana. I'm from Nicaragua. I just came to the US the last year under a Fulbright scholarship. Also, I do electrical engineering, so I don't have a political background. Still, I like these topics. And I think that under the discussion that you had, I think it's true that Latin America has moved in terms of democracy. We don't see it as a possibility now, we see it as a challenge. But there, based on my experience, I see a phenomena going on Latin America that is related to the transfer of power. Whenever it comes that we go from one party to another one after a successful election, I see that the direction of the government changes a lot. And as we were talking now about rule of power, that takes time. And sometimes these situations come and politicians, not democratic ones, take advantage and they ask for more time on the power. So my first question under that is how this phenomenon of transfer of power can be tackled so that we can create more sustainable development in our countries. And under this context, I want to bring also the other phenomena that is happening, especially on Nicaragua, that the rule of law is not being damaged. We just changed the law. Yeah. And under this topic, I want to bring onto the table the topic of re-elections. What's your opinion about re-elections? Thank you very much.
Can we take the question from that table, please? Please stand up.
Hello, my name is Carmen Williams. I am from the Dominican Republic. And my question goes to, we know that today's society is not the same as it was 20 years ago. Today's society is more based on results. So from your perspective, since Ms. President Chinchilla mentioned that we have now, we need to retrieve trust for institutions. How would you, what is your advice for us to gain and retrieve people to trust institutions in order to strengthen democracy in Latin America?
Thank you very much. So we have those two last questions. We have about 5 minutes. You have another, oh,
Excuse
please go
me,
ahead.
sorry.
Please stand up.
Hi, my name
okay.
is Maximo Dominguez. I'm from the Dominican Republic, and it is a pleasure for being here in front of you. And I want to ask a question that I think that hasn't been addressed. For me, the democracy excuse me, it's not a thing that's just election day. It's a thing that is continuous, that is previous election day and continues every day in our lives. And I want to ask, what do you think is the role of political parties in the protection of democracy? How can they avoid the rise of authoritarian leaders? Because we know that they no longer come with coups. And how can we avoid the current wave of polarization? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So last comment from the panel.
I'll go first. You know, I'll take the question on political parties because it's one that has entertained my mind for a while, as you're about to see. You know, in different incarnations, I've been attending discussions about political parties for probably 25 years, right? As an academic, as an active politician, you know, wearing different hats. Every single one of those discussions ended up with everyone with a very serious face, including myself, saying, we have to strengthen political parties because they are essential for democracy. And that's true. The problem is that after 25 years of repeating that mantra, we have nothing to show for it. The credibility of political parties is in tatters in Latin America and beyond. So it raises very interesting questions as to whether we're just flogging a dead horse. It might be that political parties, the way we understand them to be, they may be 20th century creatures. And the future of political representation lies elsewhere. And I cannot provide an answer to that. I mean, that's beyond my pay grade. You know, I haven't gotten there, you know, in terms of my answer. I mean, what can replace political parties? I don't know. I strongly suspect that part of the answer runs through this. And that we haven't been able to figure this one out. And certainly political parties have not been able to figure a useful way, a viable way to establish a connection with citizens through digital technologies. But it's a complicated question. I mean, I would love to think that we have some kind of magic wand that will allow us to strengthen political parties, but I'm very much afraid that we don't. I mean, if you ask me where I would start with an agenda to strengthen political parties, honestly, I wouldn't know where to start. I mean, their credibility is so low. So you know, the action point that flows from this is one for both academia and think tanks and other people that work on these issues to think more systematically about the future of political representation. I don't think we have, devoted enough systematic attention to that issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Anybody
Okay,
else?
I will take the one about trust, and Leonel says he will take the one about re-election. Look, I prefer to give you one example. When I was president, there were people elected me basically based on two major concerns. One was security, and the other was infrastructure. Okay, so we needed to do something very seriously about those two areas because, you know, that was my commitment with the people. And I tried two different approaches just because in one case, I knew that we had the kind of personal bureaucracy, institutional framework to do it. And in the other, because yes, it was quite different. So in security, our approach was to involve the people since the beginning. We decided, for example, to measure the problem, to state this baseline, consulting the people. A national consultation, we went to the communities, we looked for the different sectors. You know, it was something really very open and democratic. Once that we had a kind of diagnosis, of course, we also were working with robust data, many indicators, but we basically said the opinion of the people counts in this issue because security is something that takes place at the local level. I mean, the crime is local usually, and criminality. And so we start doing that. And then we design different responses at the community level. That was probably our most important approach. I mean, from the community level, we tried to tackle the crime problems. And we prepared the police to be able to deal with the communities because there is a different way to work. They have to learn how to relate with the people because it is not only about listening to the people, it's also about taking decisions in the same table with them, establishing the priorities, responding about how they are performing, et cetera, et cetera. The other area was infrastructure. And infrastructure was a totally different approach because it was almost impossible to do it differently because the institutional framework is accustomed to work in a very close and obscure manner, in a very vertical kind of format. And it was almost impossible to speak about, facilitating the participation and opening the process so the people could know what was happening. And so what happened there, I mean, in security, we succeeded. We do not only achieve our goals, but the people were very happy about the results. In infrastructure, it was a nightmare. It was a totally nightmare because everybody was suspicious if there were corruption behind the contracts, because since we didn't consult, the people didn't want the road to affect, for example, the environment or some communities, et cetera, et cetera. So what I say is that we have the keys about how to build trust with citizens. And for me, there is no other way than be transparent, be accountable. And the only way to do it is building the means, the institutional means, the venues, the mechanisms for the people to be part of the process.
Well, I'll try to respond to some of the questions that have been raised in a very broad sense, beginning with you. All right. Political parties. I think there is a crisis of confidence to institutions, including political parties in Latin America, but also worldwide. I think here in the States, there is a conversation about the role of political parties. There is a debate in Europe. In Spain, you had two parties, El PSOE y el PP, right? And now you have 4 or 5 parties. In France, two parties were leading since the end of World War II, the Gaullistas and the Socialist Party. And now you have the party led by President Macron that was just founded 5 years ago. Everywhere you look, parties are going through difficult times, but new parties are emerging. It is the old parties that are disappearing and new parties are emerging, right? And it's happening in Latin America. So we cannot look at it in an isolated way, as if it is something that is happening only in Latin America. The world is in turmoil. The world is in crisis. And I think one crisis that we tend to kind of not take account of is there is an ethical crisis. There's an ethical crisis in everything. There's an ethical crisis in politics. There's an ethical crisis in the media. There's an ethical crisis in digital media and social media. There's a crisis everywhere, an ethical crisis that we have to meet in order to regain confidence. The lack of confidence is because people see that political leaders are benefiting from the system while everybody else is struggling. So corruption has a lot to do with that. If people see that a political leader comes into power and he enriches himself pretty fast, and the rest of the people are still lacking, the solution of basic needs, well, there is a disconnect between political parties, political leaders, and the rest of the population. So we have to address the ethical issue as a core issue in order to regain confidence for democracy. And we have to train the new young leaders that come to the parties in the meaning of morality, of ethical, and being always accountable to the people, horizontally or vertically, whatever. But you must respond to the people's trust in you to lead their future. I do believe, Kevin, in that political parties have a future. It's the only way that you can really organize the people and mobilize the people. Through social media, you can, in a way, connect. You communicate, and somehow you mobilize. But these mobilizations have always been leaderless, and they end up in nothing. And I think the best example is the Arab Spring. I mean, you had uprisings in Egypt, uprisings in Syria, everywhere, but they lack leadership because leadership comes through political parties. And the thing about political parties is that they are organized in the territory. So in each state, in each province, in each territorial unit, you have people that are being organized and mobilized according to the party's philosophy, ideology, and political objectives. The only way you can really permanently mobilize is through an organization, and that is a political party. Now, political parties need to go through changes also, and they are. I founded a new party just 2 years ago. It's called, in Spanish, La Fuerza del Pueblo. In English, you would say the force of the people. It's very difficult to translate and really have the spiritual meaning that it has in Spanish, okay? In just the power of the, or people's power, I don't know, people's power, right? Okay, in just 2 years, we have registered 1.5 million Dominican citizens. In polls that were taken yesterday in Dominican Republic, the incumbent president has 38% of intention of the vote for the 2024 elections. I have 36. Just 2 years building a new party because our previous party split, the Dominican Liberation Party. And the reason it split is because the dominant leadership at the time, the incumbent president at the time, didn't understand something that worries you. He didn't understand the limits of power. Power has limits. And in democracy, the limits are the rule of law. There are rules for everything. You play the game according to rules. When you shoot, it's 2 points. If you shoot from far away, it's 3 points, right? And that's the way it should be in politics. You were elected for 4 years according to the Constitution. You respect that. You don't go over the Constitution and stay in power forever. You can't, and you cannot change the Constitution in order to stay in power, because that would be unethical. You're supposed to legislate in favor of the people, not for yourself, not for self-benefit. It doesn't work that way. So I think, creating this consciousness that there is a limit to power, that you must play the game according to the rules you accepted, I think lies I would say, the future of a sustainable democratic system. Now, about re-election, and Laura said I should respond to that. Well, I think that re-election is not bad per se. The people make a decision. If President Biden is doing a good job, the people re-elect him for a second term, right? Now, the US system originally didn't establish that it was 2 terms. It could be forever. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected 4 times. And it was after him that an amendment within the Constitution, the US Constitution, established 2 terms. But this is a decision made by the American people through its delegates in Congress. Now, we should understand that no political system is universal. We're celebrating Queen Elizabeth's 70th anniversary in power as the Queen of Britain, right? Nobody's questioning that. 70 years in power. She was never elected, and she is the head of state of the UK. The Pope, well, the Pope is, I would say, the Vatican is a state. The Pope is elected for life. Nobody questions that. Not even God is questioning that, right? So it all depends. My belief, though, is this. You can have a system in Latin America, I would say this, where you could be you're enabled to be elected for 2 terms. Elected 1 term, if you're doing well, the citizens will decide if you stay in power or not. Skip a 3rd term and may be able to come back again. Now, what is the difference? The problem is, if you are in power, you tend to use the tools of power to stay in power. But if you have to step down and come from below, I mean, it's democratic. You're participating just as someone else. Now, why do I believe in this? Because democracy in the region is still fragile, it's still young. It's not 500 years old, as Gordon Brown would say, it's just 40 years old. So democracy in Latin America is still in its infancy. And leadership comes through experience. It comes through hard work. It comes through failure. It comes through, standing up again after you've been knocked down. And you learn that through life. You learn that through experience. So depriving the possibility of having someone with experience, with democratic values, to come back again, but coming from below, not from above, I think it's a possibility. And it's a decision countries will have to make. In our case, in the Dominican Republic, we have had everything. We have had indefinite re-election, Balaguer. So he was president 7 times, right? 7 times. He was blind, 90 years old, and still leading the country. And now he's a legend. He's become a legend in the Dominican Republic and in Latin America. After that, we amended the Constitution. It was when I was elected for the first time in 1996. Don't think I'm part of a museum, right? Back in 1996, I was elected for the first time. I was not able to get re-elected for a 2nd consecutive term because the Constitution banned that. But my successor amended the Constitution for 2 consecutive terms. When he was trying to get re-elected, he lost. I came back into office in 2004. So I benefited from his reform and was able to get 2 consecutive terms, 2004, 2008, 2008, 2012. The Constitution then was amended again to come back to one term at a time. 1 term and you had to skip the 2nd term. This is where President Medina made an amendment. So he amended the Constitution to have 2 terms. He wanted to amend it again to have 3 terms. And this is where we split, right? So I'm able by the Constitution to come back again for 2 terms that will be definitely, unless we amend the Constitution again, which is something I pledge among you that I will not do if I get back into office. Okay, so this is the way it has. This is the mechanism which has worked in the Dominican Republic. Now, repítame la pregunta otra vez, ¿cómo fue?
Brevemente, presidente,
Sí.
porque tiene una reunión.
Ok, perfecto.
Sí,
Pero para no dejar los dominicanos fuera,
ok.
que después me lo
Pero
critiquen allá,
brevemente.
¿eh? Well, briefly, what was your question? I think I answered that. I think I answered that. And you? I think I answered that too. I think it's an ethical question. Okay. All right, thank you.
Rebecca, you're the last one.
Okay, I'll make this very brief because I know I'm standing in the way of lunch, but I think I really love the way you framed it by saying that democracy doesn't stop after the election and then it's every day you work on it. I really appreciated that. And really quickly on re-election, I agree that the number of terms doesn't necessarily matter. So Mexico, for instance, you serve for a sexennial. And for many years, Mexico was undemocratic because the president had the dedazo and he could pick his next president. So even though there was a term limit, it was far from a democracy. I think what's worrisome is the trend, and this is not the case in Dominican Republic, I want to say, is when a leader amends a constitution, when he's in power, to stay in power, oftentimes indefinitely. And that's why I think the agencies of horizontal accountability are what we should be focusing on which is part of the rule of law, because that's what enables a dominant executive or a hyper president so and it comes from the right and the left, right? It's not just leftist or presidents from the right that do this. But it's almost like there's been a playbook created and presidents are learning from one another how to do this. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This concludes the panel. If things have gone according to plan, we should have lunch boxes outside. So I invite you all to continue the conversation outside. If you have somewhere to go, you can take the lunchbox with you. I'd just like to conclude by thanking the panel for an incredibly substantive discussion. Thank you all, and please join me in giving a round of applause.